want members to see our current board members. And we ask one board member to each month to introduce a speaker, and Mike McKay is going to come up and introduce our speaker today. Mike is in his first of his 2-year term on our board and will make the introduction. Mike joined our Rotary Club in 2012 and has been a Rotarian since 1999. He is a cradle Rotarian. He's third-generation Rotarian and former member and past president of the Rotary Club of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Mike serves as a mentor to one of our Rotary scholars, is a member of our Rotary Youth Exchange Committee and the Hospitality Subcommittee. He's also co-chair of our club's bowling fellowship. Mike. Thanks.
Thank you, President Charles. I wore my Rotary colors today. It's my great honor today, Rotarians and guests, to introduce our speaker. That is Dan Tokaji. He is the Fred W. Vi Miller Dean and Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin Law School. Dean Tokaji became Dean of the University of Wisconsin Law School in 2020, joining us here in Wisconsin from Ohio, where he served as Associate Dean for Faculty in the Charles W. Ebersold and Florence Whitcomb Ebersold Professor of Constitutional Law at Ohio State University. He's a graduate of Harvard College and earned his Juris Doctor degree from Yale Law School and clerked for the Honorable Stephen Reinhardt of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. He's taught at Harvard Law School, Hong Kong University, Oxford University on a wide variety of courses including civil procedure, civil rights lawyering, and comparative constitutional law. He's published over 50 law articles, book chapters, and other scholarly papers. As it turns out, I had actually purchased one of his books. He's co-author on Beyond Imagination, along with our Chancellor, Jennifer Mukin. And it was interesting that I had the book when I heard he was going to be a speaker. So today, Dean Tokaji is going to talk with us about current and looming issues in the primary field of election law, including election administration, redistricting, and campaign finance, timely subjects. Dean Tokaji, we look forward to your presentation today. We are making a contribution in your name to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way to say thank you for speaking to us. I also want to remind the audience that we will have Q&A with the speaker as time permits at the end, but please wait for the microphone. And with that, let's welcome Dean Dan Tokaji.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for that exceptionally kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for making time from your busy day to be here. I am very honored to be invited to speak to the Rotary Club and impressed by how many of you are actually here today. But then I learned it was not because of me. It's Taco Day, everybody. And I'm just happy. Those of you who I know several of you, some of you have even had the pleasure of breaking bread with, and if you've had that experience, you know that I'm a really sloppy eater. So it's kind of miraculous I did not get the salsa all over my tie. I'm really delighted to have a chance to speak with you about my primary field of election law. I started teaching at Ohio State 2000. Yeah, I heard the boo. That's all right. I know who writes the checks, and so you know that I will be rooting for Bucky and not Brutus in a couple of weeks. I've been dean here at University of Wisconsin Law School for the last 3 years. And when I first arrived, 2020 to 2021, while all this was going on, people would ask me the question, boy, it must be a really exciting time to be in election law with all that's going on. And, the truth is, it's always a really exciting time to be in election law, especially in a year divisible by 4. But I was actually a little bit relieved, I have to say, at that time, to be dean of a law school rather than mostly working on election laws I'd been doing for the previous 17 years. Why? Because as a dean of a law school, I'm actually working on problems that I can solve. And I say that jokingly, but also somewhat seriously, because the problems in our democracy, in all seriousness, are quite severe. And it's not just in the United States. it's around the world, although in some respects things are especially dire here, starting with the reality, which has been growing for the last 4 decades or so, of rising polarization. And not just that we as Americans believe different things, but tend to view each other not as people with a shared set of values who disagree about certain things, but rather as enemies. That's a really serious problem in a democracy that depends upon bipartisan compromise to get things done as ours does. And so it's one of the reasons I'm especially fortunate to be speaking with you all as Rotarians today, because this is one of those organizations where people really do come together across ideological lines. I'm sure there are people in this room who are of both political parties as well as independents, and that's a really important thing in our society, forging these social bonds and realizing that as Americans, the things that bring us together are more important than the things that separate us. So it's in that spirit that I now turn to topics that I know, look, they're extremely divisive, and they're things on which, sometimes for understandable reasons, we often disagree with, and frequently across party lines. My main goal here is really, especially in the first 3 parts of my presentation, to be descriptive, to describe some of the big issues that have been going on in this country really over the past 2 decades or so primarily. I do want to make sure to allow some time for questions, and I'll editorialize a little bit at the end about what I see as kind of some of the big picture problems that we're facing. But let me start with my primary field of election administration. By this I mean, the rules governing the voting process, what most of you probably think about when you think of election laws. For example, rules regarding absentee ballots and voter registration and voting machines and voter ID. These are topics that have really become much more significant and gotten a lot more attention over the past 23 years or so. And by and large, I think that's a really good thing. And as I'll explain, I think we've made some really significant improvements in this realm during that period of time. So just a few things to bear in mind about our system in particular. First, if you compare the United States to other countries, one of the things that really stands out is that we are extraordinarily decentralized. We have not one election system, or even 50 in this country, but literally thousands. Here in Wisconsin, for example, our elections are mostly run at the municipal level, and there are some more than 1,800 local authorities that are charged with running our elections. Administration of elections in the United States is also to a significant extent partisan. What I mean by that is that in most states you actually have a chief election official who is affiliated with one of the major parties or the other, usually the Secretary of State who runs in a partisan election. We have a somewhat different system here in Wisconsin, and we formerly had really the only nonpartisan model of election administration anywhere in the country. We now have much more of a bipartisan model, but one that I think still works pretty well. So election law in the United States, mostly a matter of state law and local practice, and partisan in the sense that many of the people running our elections are in fact affiliated with one side or the other. There is this thin but important level of federal law at the top: the United States Constitution, the Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act, and the Help America Vote Act. Those are the main laws governing the voting process, but most of the law comes from the states, and there is also a lot of variation in how things work from county to county, or here in Wisconsin, from municipality to municipality. So, the modern history of election administration really begins with the 2000 election between Bush and Gore. You remember this guy. At least most of you do. Some of you may actually be too young to remember. And I now have to remind myself, because this is around the time that I entered the field, that some of my students were just barely born at the time that this election took place. So whatever one feels about the outcome, an upside, at least in my view, of what happened in 2000 is that it really focused public attention, as well as legislative attention, on the infrastructure of American democracy, which in the decades preceding had largely been neglected. So we saw a lot of changes, including changes to voting equipment, statewide registration lists, provisional voting. We saw the enactment of a major piece of legislation, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which made money available for desperately needed improvements and established some basic rules applicable across the state, even though election law, as I mentioned, is mostly a matter of state law to this day. Of course, the debate has, over this period of time, been largely partisan, with Democrats generally advocating laws that promote access, Republicans generally more concerned with integrity or the security of the ballot. And we've seen this play out in many areas, probably most significantly the debate over voter ID, but lots of other things too, including absentee ballots and voter registration rules. So flash forward to 2020. Here's the thing about the 2020 election. You'll recall this was the pandemic. I know we're all blocking that out of our minds, but it occasioned this huge shift in how people voted, right? From in-person voting to remote voting, right? We saw record turnout, the highest as a percentage since 1904 and well over a century, and this incredible shift from in-person to mail voting going from about 21% of the electorate to 46%. We'd seen the percentage of people voting remotely, that is through in-person early voting or through usually mail-in absentee, increasing over the years, but it really shot up in the last election. And this was really, as these two respected election scholars have noted, quite a miracle that we managed this transition so successfully. And, there are always problems in every election, but pretty well. That's the miracle. The tragedy is so many people don't believe it, right? So many people think that the 2020 election was stolen, and we had a lot of lawsuits. There are always a lot of lawsuits in every election year, but we had more than ever in 2020. Some of that was things related to the pandemic. Others were cases filed on or after Election Day challenging the result. And what was really distinctive is the involvement of one of the presidential contenders, President Trump, in that litigation, either he or his allies. They brought some 73 lawsuits after the election, only 2 of which were successful. And this is actually one of my law school classmates who's a Trump appointee on the Third Circuit, Judge Stefanos Bibas. This was pretty typical of the decisions that were rendered during and after the 2024 election. And it's a great quote from Judge Bibas. "Free, fair elections are the lifeblood of democracy. Charges of unfairness are serious, but calling an election unfair does not make it so. Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here." And it's pretty typical of what happened in that election. And I want to emphasize Republican and Democratic affiliated judges alike, right? Because you may be able to lie on camera and get away with it, at least with much of the electorate. It doesn't work. It doesn't usually work, at least, in a court of law, which demands evidence and reasoned argument. And so it was in 2020. Now, of course, notwithstanding that, we do have this continuing crisis of confidence in our election system, but there are some good things that have happened as well. One of them is this bipartisan bill backed by Senator McConnell along with Chuck Schumer in the Senate, the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Act. I've put up on the screen some of the key changes made. I'm not going to read everything, by the way, just in the interests of time, because I want to allow enough time for Q&A. But this is a good thing. We had this bipartisan bill, which at least eliminates some, though certainly not all, of the potential sources of controversy and potentially chaos in subsequent elections. We've also seen a lot of states change their laws. This is actually a slide that I borrowed from my colleague, also an election law expert, Rob Yablon, who, along with Professor Miriam Seifter, runs our State Democracy Research Initiative, looking at what's going on in the states. Without getting too much into the weeds, there have been a lot of changes in the states. And, it's what you would expect in Democratic states, more liberalization of voting rules. In Republican states tends to be more restrictive laws being enacted. We've also seen a lot of people, so-called election deniers, running for office, such as this fellow in the state of Arizona. By and large, those candidates did not fare very well in the 2022 election. We'll see what happens in a couple of years. But one of the things, going back to this slide for a minute, let me go back here for a minute, that I have become concerned about, although I don't have a slide on it here, is, there have been a lot of improvements over the last 20 years, and a lot of professionalization of our election system, which is an unqualifiedly good thing. It's become a very unpleasant job to be an election official, especially in a swing state like ours. So we really owe a debt of gratitude to these people who do that hard, often not just thankless, but work for which they receive a lot of not just criticism, but sometimes threats. And I am worried because a lot of really good election officials have been leaving the field. It's become a quite unpleasant job in many places. I think our election system will hold up pretty well, at least in terms of running our next election next year, believe it or not, effectively. But I am worried about this crisis of confidence in election administration. So moving on to the subject of redistricting, something that here in Wisconsin we've heard a lot about over the last decade or so. It's funny, I worked on a ballot measure initiative campaign in my former state of Ohio a little more than 10 years ago, back in 2012. And back then, when I would speak to an audience like this one, you often had to explain what redistricting was, and that it had nothing to do with school districts, right? It was something different. It's quite amazing what an increase in public understanding of redistricting and the related problem of gerrymandering there's been over the past decade or so. And I think that is a really good thing as well. So every decade, for those who are not familiar by now, states have to redraw their legislative districts in accordance with U.S. Census figures. Redistricting is typically handled by the state legislature or an entity under its control. There are some states that have independent commissions, but for the most part, that's how it happens. And guess what? Legislators, they're partisan. They have an incentive to draw district lines to benefit themselves and their party. The first instinct of power, as the late Justice Scalia once wrote, is the retention of power, and gerrymandering is a great example of this. The term comes from Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, who drew this district in the center that someone thought was shaped like a salamander. Even though his name was Gary, the term has come down to us as gerrymandering. And here's a classic example. This was the first chance I had to watch I got to watch a redistricting process close up. I went to a lot of the legislative hearings, and man, it's worse than watching sausage being made, let me tell you. This is a pattern that held up throughout the last decade. Ohio, at least at the beginning of this decade, was a pretty purple state. It became more Republican over the course of the decade. But look at that split. 12 Republican districts, 4 Democratic districts. That held up throughout the last decade. Well, how do you do that in a state that's fairly evenly split? Draw 3/4 of the districts that are held by one party. Well, what you do is you concentrate as many of the other side's voters in as few districts as possible. I teach this when I teach election law, by the way. I'm like, I know some of you may use this power for ill rather than good, but I would not be doing my job if I didn't teach you how to do it. And so Here's an example of how you do it. This is what I call the LeBron James district, because it goes from Akron to Cleveland. Get it? It's an 80% Democratic district that was really drawn, sorry, let me go back there for a second, to bring together the overwhelmingly Democratic Cleveland and Akron areas, which is with as little of the in-between areas as possible. And that was the same approach taken with this next district, the so-called Snake on the Lake, which stretches all the way from Cleveland to Toledo, Ohio. Again, packing voters in those two areas. I once did a field trip. By the way, this district was designed to pit two Democratic incumbents, Marcy Kaptur, a UW grad, by the way, and Denny Kucinich, not sure what he's doing now, against each other. Kaptur wound up winning. I once did a kind of field trip through this district when I was at a speaking engagement in Toledo, trying to walk through the district. Well, it turns out you can't drive through it, nor can you even walk through it. You wind up in the middle of this marsh outside the Toledo area, the McGee Marsh, which is a great place if you want to see eagles nesting. But there are no voters there. Why would they do this? Well, they're trying to get as many voters in the Cleveland and Toledo areas packed into this district to make that district overwhelmingly Democratic, which winds up effectively diluting Democratic votes. And I'm not passing judgment here, right? This is exactly what I would do if I were, say, a lawyer or someone else trying to draw a gerrymander. But I'm trying to illustrate how this gets done. Now, in Rucho versus Common Cause, decided 4 years ago, the Supreme Court says you can't make federal claims alleging partisan gerrymandering. This is what we call a political question, which is not a question about politics, right? Courts actually decide questions about politics all the time. It means it's a question that is reserved for the political branches of government, i.e. the legislature or the executive branch, rather than the courts. We have, however, and are seeing a lot of state constitutional cases because state courts are free to conclude that their state constitutions prohibit partisan gerrymandering. I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time and go to a couple of recent cases that involve redistricting. Significant cases. One of them is Allen versus Milligan. This was a case in which a lot of people, myself included, were really afraid the Supreme Court was going to create a really big hole, I guess I should say another big hole, in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, perhaps the most successful civil rights legislation in history. They didn't do it. They wound up actually preserving the standard that had existed since a case called Thornburg versus Jingles way back in 1986, an opinion by Justice William Brennan. And just last week, the U.S. District Court down in Alabama, from which this case came, ordered a plan that includes two districts from which African American voters have the opportunity to elect their representatives of choice. The other big case decided this past term is the so-called independent state legislature theory case. The basic idea here was that, and I do say was that state legislatures in making rules for federal elections can't be constrained by state constitutions. Well, the court, in an opinion by Chief Justice Roberts, rejected that idea. However, the court did leave the door open to claims that it might violate the United States Constitution if state courts apply their state constitutions to federal elections in ways that go well beyond precedent. It's not so clear exactly what the boundaries of this is. This is an idea that Chief Justice Rehnquist had formulated and argued in his concurrence way back in the Bush versus Gore opinion in 2000. But it is something to look out for, because we might see the Supreme Court superintending state courts if, for example, let's just say hypothetically, some state court were to rule that state legislative districts or really congressional districts violate the state constitution. We could see claims going up to the U.S. Supreme Court that that is in violation of the federal constitution. So moving on to money and politics, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this in the interest of time, but you know, the amount of money that's spent on election campaigns goes up, and you know, part of this has to do with the Citizens United opinion that came out back in 2010, which effectively removed any limit on for-profit corporations' expenditures in elections, saying that that would violate the First Amendment. I wrote a report with Renata Strauss now 9 years ago that was talking about what was happening after the Citizens United decision. And here's the thing. We talked to Republicans and Democrats, people across the ideological spectrum. If you were creating a campaign finance system from scratch, nobody, and I do mean nobody, would create a system like ours. Why? Well, we've got limits on the amount that can go to candidates, campaigns, and parties, but there's no limit under federal law on the amount that can go outside the system, as it were, through these so-called independent groups, super PACs, nonprofits. So we've got all this money going outside the system, and still most of it, but less as a proportionate share going through candidates and parties. And the money that's going outside the system is really totally unaccountable and, to a large degree, untraceable. I won't go through the details here, but, you know, the industries that you'd expect are contributing or spending a lot, or pretty much what you'd expect with lawyers and law firms near the top of the list. Thank you very much. And, you know, here's a big change. More contributions coming from the exceptionally rich, from billionaires and multi-billionaires. So, big picture, and this is the subject on which I'll contend. You know, the problems in my field of election law can be formidable, and you know, if moving back to the image with which I began this presentation of the January 6th insurrection, which was the subject of the book chapter that Mike mentioned, you know, we see a lot of different things coming together. And I do very much worry, more so than I ever have, about the future of American democracy, especially the polarization we're experiencing right now, that we saw last week. I know it seems like eons ago with everything that's happened since then, including the terrible events in Israel. But you know, these are really serious problems for our democracy, fueling a loss of faith. And we're not alone. We're not alone in being a country where you're seeing some teetering towards, at times, autocracy or maybe even authoritarianism. It's happening around the world, even in well-established democracies like ours. And I think the causes for this are complex, but at least one contributor, and here I'm going to focus on the United States. I think the evidence, the social science evidence, is pretty clear that rising economic inequality is a big part of the problem, the underlying problem. If you look at these lines, and I'm going to go here, Thomas Edsall has been, if you read his column in the New York Times, really a great commentator on this stuff. But you look at these two lines, which are economic inequality and political polarization. This is in the U.S. You see that they move pretty close to being in tandem. And this is going back not just over the past 4 decades, when both have been steadily increasing, but really over the past century or so. And I'm not sure that the social scientists, empirical social scientists in particular political scientists, have completely explained this. But if you think about it, it does make some sense, right? Like, if people are feeling frustrated, if people feel like they don't really have a shot at the American dream, if there's a lack of social mobility, as there increasingly has been in the United States, they get really frustrated with our political system. And they tend towards the extremes, including sometimes towards authoritarian leaders. We see this in the United States. We see it in other countries. Sometimes it's people on the far right, sometimes it's people on the far left. But I do think that in the long run, getting our arms around these huge political problems requires that we take seriously this rising economic inequality and attendant loss of social mobility that has been rising over the past few years. I also think that we as lawyers have a really important role to play. This was kind of the theme of that book chapter that I wrote. Courts, as I mentioned, I think did a really good job, Republican and Democratic affiliated judges alike, with the cases that came up in 2020. And this fidelity to truth, right? This fidelity to truth, to evidence-based fact-finding, to reasoned argument, to the principled application of law. These are hallmarks of our profession. And so one of the things I try to teach our students and aspiring lawyers is that these are their responsibilities. They have a responsibility to leave our democracy better than they found it. And without prejudging what you all might think of what I've said so far, I suspect that your participation in a great civic group like this is evidence that you all are committed to be part of the solution as well. And with that, I don't know how much time we have, but I'm happy to take questions. Yeah. Why don't you just take the microphone around to whoever, yeah.
Yep, got it.
Yep. Good morning, Greg Zakarski. My wife will say I tilt towards somewhat archaic legislation, but part of the electoral problem I see is a lack of dilution. In 1929, Congress passed the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929 and froze the number of House Representative seats at 435.
Yeah.
Significantly smaller population than 112 million, 340 million today, no growth. There are some congressional districts in the United States that have nearly 1 million people represented by one person.
Right.
And then you have places like Wyoming and South Dakota where they get an entire electoral vote. What's your view on, well, and then you look at England, that's 1/5 of our population, that has 693 members of parliament.
Yeah.
So your question.
My question is that something with which I should arm myself and assail my representatives, duly elected representatives, to fix?
Yeah, so I'm a bit agnostic on the question of whether the size of the House should be increased. I do feel, I guess, reasonably strongly that while it might help, it's not likely to make a huge difference in these big picture problems like polarization. But I can understand the argument why it might be helpful if members of our House of Representatives, especially in big states, states other than Wyoming and the others that you alluded to, we're representing a smaller number of people.
Hi, I'm Karen Kendrick Hans. Thanks. We like to think of ourselves as a globally connected network of local community leaders.
Yeah.
We got some problems. This is a group you might look to solve them. What's your call to action for this global network of local leaders?
Wonderful question. I've had a slide on this in other presentations. I cut it. I didn't include it today. Maybe I should have. But, I think there are a lot of things that you can do. Let me start with sort of the easiest thing, something that just about everybody here could do if you've got the time. Volunteer to be a poll worker, right? If you want to make a difference at the local level, it's a great thing that all of you can do. And in many communities, they're desperately needed. Our system really relies on volunteers and near volunteers. Become a part of groups, including, nonprofit organizations or even, partisan organizations. I think individuals can do a lot of good by becoming active. And there's actually evidence that membership in groups like this one, right, makes it actually a big difference in terms of promoting a healthy democracy, even when you're not talking about political issues and forging social bonds upon which our society depends. I'll also say what you can do on an individual level, and I try to do this probably not as successfully as I would like. Make sure you're taking in information that disagrees from your priors, right? Like, don't just consume media with which you're ideologically aligned. Force yourselves, and I know it's sometimes hard, it's hard for me, but to read perspectives that differ from your own. They may not persuade you, you may not persuade them or people who agree, but you'll learn something. And I think it's always good to to question our own pre-existing beliefs, and taking in information and perspectives that differ from our own is a great way of doing that.
Here.
Marv Levy.
Hey, Marv.
Could you stand?
I can stand my old friend Dan. I'm very intrigued about your editorial comments.
Yeah.
So would you care to tell me, do you favor a transition from an equal opportunity society to an equal outcome society, including such issues as guaranteed annual income or reparations?
Yeah. You're getting beyond my pay grade here. I actually favor taking equality of opportunity seriously, right? Because I don't think we have anywhere near equality of opportunity in this country. And let me say this as a father, right? Like, my kids are very lucky. I got a 14-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son. They're very lucky, but I look across town, let alone to other cities and, parts of Chicago or wherever it might be. There's no way that a lot of those kids have the same opportunities that my kids have. So I'm a believer in equality of opportunity, Marv, but I do think if we had genuine equality of opportunity, we could come a lot closer than we are now to equality of results, too. But no, in terms of the principle I favor, it is squarely equality of opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Dean Tokaji, for a very interesting discussion. I think we should have you back next year after the presidential election to talk about what election laws happened during that process. So I forgot to mention that on the back table, our Community Projects Committee are collecting books. This is what that flyer was for, not the other thing I mentioned. So please bring their collecting books for the Madison Reading Project, and you can stop by the table for more information and bring your books next week. Right, Tim? Great. Thank you. I hope you'll all join us next week when we're going to hear about this year's Wisconsin Innovation Awards that are being announced later today. These awards celebrate and inspire innovation and highlight the creative spirit from the state's leading public, private, and nonprofit sectors. We'll hope to hear from a few winners, too. It would be very interesting. Thank you all for coming today. Before we leave, let's please stand and we'll recite the Rotary four-way test of the things we think, say, and do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Have a great week, everyone. We are adjourned.